In the 1980s, there was a couple from Switzerland who were really having a knockdown, drag-out day. It started off when the husband canceled a vacation that he and his wife were going to have. And she was so disappointed by this, she poured bicarbonate soda in the fish tank that was his, had all these rare tropical fish in there, killed every one of them. So he was not happy about that. So he took some of his wife's diamond jewelry and put it down in the food processor and stirred everything all up and killed that, basically, if you want to call it that. She went over and unplugged all of his stereo gear and took it and threw it out in the pool. Well, not to be undone, he took a $250,000 Picasso off the wall and kicked a hole in it. And she was making plans to go out and to sink his 38-foot yacht when the daughter called the police. She said, enough is enough. But the problem is the police heard about it and they say, you know what, there is no law against destroying your own property. So they couldn't do anything. So finally the daughter got a hold of the family's attorney. He convinced them to call a truce with each other. Now, can you imagine how that might have continued to escalate? Man, this is the story of two foolish people who are in a downward spiral of hardness and arrogance and destruction. Well, in today's message, there are two men who are doing something similar. They have this situation where each one of them is stubborn. Each one of them is hard-hearted for a little while. And each one of them are bent on destruction. And we're going to find out about that story together. Let me give you some background on it. If you're looking there in chapter 25 of 1 Samuel, you'll notice that there's the first man that's mentioned is David. Now, David is the guy who is going to be the next king of Israel, but he's not king yet. And he has been pursued for quite some time by the current king named Saul. Saul is jealous of David, doesn't like David, wants to get rid of him because of David's popularity. So David's been on the run for a while. And Saul has been trying to track him down in these variety of places. 6 times, Saul has tried to kill David. And every time, of course, he has failed in this. David even had the opportunity one time to kill King Saul, but chose not to do that. Chose to say, God, I want to put you first. God, I want to show restraint and mercy right here. David had been trusting in God's ways and God's timing and God's ways more than his own. But as the story opens up right here, we find that David is not on the run right now. What he's doing is he and 600 men who are kind of like these tough guys, they're all kind of bandits in a way from a variety of different places. They're all kind of outcasts hanging together, but they're riding around the perimeter of a ranch that belongs to a guy named Nabal, who I'll describe to you here in just a minute. These guys are providing like a neighborhood watch for Nabal and his ranch. They're going around and they're making sure that no one comes in and steals or kills any of the animals that are there. And so they're providing this service for him, and they're doing this free of charge. It's just out of the goodness of their hearts. He didn't ask them to do it. They are just doing it. And then there's Nabal. Nabal is a crusty, crotchety rancher. His name, Nabal, means fool in the Bible. I'm not sure if his parents gave him that name or not. That'd be like the boy named Sue, right? I mean, that'd be pretty tough for a guy like that to grow up with a name, Nabal, meaning fool. But he was definitely a guy who lived up to his name, or down to it, depending on how you want to look at it. He was somebody who was not very good. He was unapproachable. He was unteachable. He was arrogant. He was selfish. He was hard-hearted. The story here in 1 Samuel says he was churlish or hard. And he was also very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and he had 3,000 sheep. Now, here's a guy who really had it. See, in that day, the culture was that if you had farm animals, they were sort of like your investment. They were a sign of your wealth. And so he is looked at in his culture and in his society as a guy that's really loaded. I mean, he has the dough. And, the ewe and the dough out there, okay? There might have been a few deer out there. Anyway, we find there's another person in the story, and that other person is a woman. And that's the Wonder Woman that we're going to look at today as we get a little further on in this message. Her name is Abigail. And Abigail is somebody who is well known for being gracious, and she is a beautiful woman. Her name in Hebrew there means my father is joyous. That means that when she was born, that her father was extremely delighted in the fact that she was born. Usually in those days, it was the boys who were looked at with more delight than the girls. But here she's looked at with a lot of delight. she turned into being a beautiful, wonderful, smart lady. And as we can see, Nabal and Abigail are really mismatched right here. You ever find that in couples today? You know, there's a mismatch. I mean, Nabal had definitely married above his grade. There's no doubt about that. And sometimes you see this one person who is in the modern marriage who is very friendly and outgoing and kind, and they take care of themselves, and everybody loves to be around them. Then there's the other person that, you know, is churlish and hard, and they're kind of uncouth, you know, and don't really take care of themselves too much, and they're not very friendly or outgoing, and you wonder, how did those people ever get together? Now, in the first service, there were people who were elbowing each other and looking at each other. I'm glad to see that all of you here today are well matched. But in that first service, there's a rough bunch there, okay? Some of them were giving each other the evil eye during that time. And that's talking about you, buddy, right there. All right. And what we find here is that Abigail is in this situation. It's not a happy marriage, probably arranged marriage. And she has been living with Nabal, and they're not very happy together. So it's not a very, very nice situation. And here we find that there's a request that comes in from David and his men. David says, you know what, we've been providing this neighborhood watch for Nabal for a long time. It's sheep shearing time, which is always kind of a festive time. It's a time where there's a lot of wealth exchange because of the fact that wool is available and sheep maybe for sale during that time as well. And so it's a situation where it's happy, it's joyous. And so Nabal's guys are out there and they're shearing the sheep, and it's a good time. And so David says, you know, we've been guarding this ranch for a long time. We've been getting nothing out of it. We've been doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. So why don't we ask for something in return at this point? So he picks 10 guys from his 600 men. He tells them to go down to Nabal's ranch and to say this: long life to you. Say, in case you didn't notice, our boss David has been helping you for the past months. Your shepherds haven't met any bandits thanks to David, and now we hear that you're shearing the sheep, throwing a big feast. So please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find. Now, they're very polite with Nabal. They're respectful to Nabal. And hoping they're going to get this courtesy payback right here. But David has been guarding these sheep for free for this whole time. He's saying, you know, it's really kind of about time that we get something in return for this. He's not asking for the ranch. He's asking just for some food and the opportunity to maybe meet with them during the time of this big feast that they're going to have. He wants some Happy Meals, so to speak, that are supersized. And so he sends these guys off to Nabal to ask. And here they are. They're asking, and they're very polite. And they're just waiting for Nabal's reply, and it comes pretty quickly. I can imagine Nabal. Maybe you can imagine him, too, in the same way. Here's a guy that's kind of burly and kind of mean-looking, and his face just gets even meaner-looking. Spits on the ground, wipes his mouth off, and starts talking to these guys. And he is not very polite or very friendly back to them. He said, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days." Now, that's a slam to David, because all of Israel knows that David is going to be the next king. Everybody knows that David has been anointed to be the next king. Everybody knows that Saul has been chasing David because of jealousy right here. And so he is saying, who is this guy? This kind of young punk out here. He's probably left his master. He's kind of slamming him right here. And he knows who he is because he calls him the son of Jesse. How would he know that unless the story had gotten around about Samuel going to Jesse's house and anointing David to be the next king? Nabal calls him a servant right here. Now, he was aware of who David was. And some people might think, well, maybe Nabal wasn't aware of 600 guys surrounding his ranch all the time. Believe me, he knew. He was somebody who was grateful that those guys were out there because there weren't any pirates or any thieves coming in and stealing the animals. And yet at the same time, he was going to take advantage of David. He wasn't going to try to give him anything back in return. He is definitely grateful that David has done this. Now, also, there's another thing. Nabal is probably aligned with King Saul. He's saying, listen, if I become a friend of David, or if I even allow David to come to my house, then certainly Saul might not look at that very favorably. I might lose everything I have. I might even lose my life. And so he's just being mean to David and not accepting to him at all, even though hospitality was the accepted obligation of the day. He's going to take advantage of David, but he's not going to help him right here. And you would think that Nabal would respond with gratitude and with generosity, but instead, in front of everybody, he sneers something else. He says, why should I take my bread and water and meat and give it to them? Now, it's interesting because the Hebrew describes the tone of voice that Nabal has right here. And it uses a word or a phrase that means it's like the sound of a shrieking bird of prey as it is coming out of the sky, getting ready to grab a hold of its victim. You know how a bird on TV, you've heard them before, kind of screechy sound? That's kind of the sound that Nabal is making right here, kind of pouncing on the victim right here. And there's something else we need to see in this as well. He says bread and water and meat. He is getting ready to have this huge feast. And there's going to be a lot more there than just bread and water and meat. He is basically talking about bologna sandwiches right here. And I'm not going to give David or his people even bologna sandwiches. I'm not going to give them this lunch meat right here. I'm not even going to do that. Instead, they get absolutely nothing. Well, David's men come back and they report the condescending attitude that Nabal had. And David has heard enough. He says, put on your swords. And David is telling these guys, put the sword on, get on your horse, and get ready to ride. And as he's going off, the Bible tells how angry David is. He says that he's saying to himself that he is not even going to allow one person, one male in the household of Nabal to even survive in the morning. This is a classic case of road rage back in those days. David needs some anger management right here. He is really, really uptight. And what's interesting here is he is forgetting God, and he is in danger of destroying himself right here. Isn't it interesting that Saul can pursue him for all these months and try to kill him 6 different times? David has the opportunity to kill Saul and passes it by, extends mercy to him, tries to be kind to Saul in return. Here's the guy trying to kill him. Nabal says, nope. Can't even have anything at my household, not even bologna sandwiches. And David's ready to swoop down with 400 other guys and kill every male that's in the household. Boy, has he got his priorities turned around here, doesn't he? He is amazing. He's been so good to Saul, and now just this one time, because of Nabal's attitude, he is getting ready to respond in a very terrible way. If David has successfully taken out Nabal, we need to think about it. If David had taken out Nabal, if David had left a scorched earth right there where Nabal lived, can you imagine what King Saul would be saying? He would say, aha, I told you, David is a dangerous renegade. We need to take him out. See what I'm saying there? Because David didn't even think about how Saul would respond to him, how Saul would have wanted posters up all over town and then added extra things on there, killed Nabal and his household, take him out. Anybody who finds him, there's a great reward to be found. Now, in the story right here, we find there's a lot of tension that's beginning to build. Here's David and his 400 guys, because he left 200 back to guard the property that they have. And now 400 guys are riding really just angry. You can see the snorting of the horses almost, happening right here, and that sound of the hooves as they're riding along. And we find this situation is really tense. The best stories that we know of, the best movies that we know of, have an element of tension to them, don't they? They might be going smoothly for a while, and then suddenly there's a twist that causes this tension to come in. And while the tension's there, you're feeling it, aren't you? You're saying, oh, I'm feeling tense. I wonder what's going to happen next. And the music is playing to kind of produce this tenseness in you as well. You know the mood has changed. Well, if we were listening to music and a movie of this right now, we would see the mood has changed. Things are getting ready to happen right here that are not good. And that's when we're really introduced to Wonder Woman, Abigail. Abigail was a woman of action. She was a woman of real action. As Nabal's servants had heard what he had said, and they knew that he had just offended 600 really angry hotheads out there in the desert. And so they go to Abigail and they tell her the story. They say this. They say, Nabal is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Now, if you were Abigail, what would you do at that point? You might call 911, right? I say, I need reinforcements out here. We need help. Send out the siren people, okay? Get them out here. She might go to Nabal and say, this is another fine mess that you've gotten us into again. Why do you always do stuff like this? She might look up at God and say, why me? Why do I have to put up with this? But instead of doing those things, she swings into action. She's beautiful and she's smart. And the same Hebrew word, or same Hebrew phrase, she lost no time, is used 4 times to describe her as a woman of action. She loads up these donkeys, and she is putting on a lot more than bread and meat and water. She is loading it up with food. She's got wine. She's got roasted lamb. She even puts in some holiday goodies because of the harvest season, fig cakes and raisin cakes. And she is preparing all this. She's got these donkeys all loaded down, and they are getting ready to go and to meet up with David and his men. What we find about her, she is a woman of courage. Wow, she really is a courageous individual. Have you ever flown out of Tampa Airport? If you have, I think you're going to be able to understand what I'm saying and definitely identify with what I'm saying. Because if you're flying out of the Tampa Airport, you're flying, you take off the runway, and of course there's a pretty steep incline. It goes pretty quickly. But as you're looking, if you're near the window, you're looking out the window, and down below, you're seeing some landmarks down there. You might look out there and say, hey, there's the Howard Franklin Bridge down there, or there's Dale Mabry. Or there's where the Bucks play, or the Yankees have their spring training, or there's some ponds I didn't even know were there, and look at that traffic jam over there. And you're seeing all these things as you're flying out, and the reason you're able to see all of them is because you're up above. You have a perspective which is different than those people who are down on the ground experiencing it down there, don't you? And if we were to take a 1,000-foot view or a 2,000-foot view of what's happening in this story right now, on one side, can you imagine with me, here comes David and his men, and they are riding over these hills, and they're coming down through a ravine. And over on this side, here comes Abigail, and she's got these donkeys, and they're all loaded down with all this food. She's coming along slowly. These guys have a big old cloud of dust coming behind them, and all of a sudden, God orchestrates the timing that they all kind of come together in this one spot. Now, that's a part of the movie that we're waiting to see what's going to happen here. What's going to happen here in this particular time. And what we find here is that Abigail's courage comes through, and her persuasiveness as well. Her speech in verse 24 goes like this. She says, "My Lord, let the blame be on me alone." She is deflecting the blame off of Nabal. She's taking it on herself. She says, "Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say." She is approaching David and his 400 men right here with a lot of humility. She's coming into the situation, and she's very respectful. She says the term, "my Lord," 14 times in her speech. She is very humble before him, and she knows that David is going to be the next king. And she is a woman of faith, and she believes that David is truly God's king. She has a lot of respect for him. She's showing honor to David. She's showing honor to God by her attitude right here, with her humility and her winsomeness as well. And here is a key thought for you and for me as well. Nabal doesn't listen to anyone, and it is called the way of the fool. David is acting like a fool. But the question is, will he listen to what Abigail has to say? Will he hear what God has to say through her? We find that her speech here is like a masterpiece of persuasion. It's charming, and it's ultimately disarming. Notice what she says to David in verses 28 through 31. First she tells him, "David, remember, God gave you a promise. Your house will endure. God called you, David, to fight his battles. Live up to your calling," David, is essentially what she is saying to him right there. And then she says to David, "David, you are held tightly in God's hands, but your enemies will be hurled aside as a stone is thrown from a sling." I like that imagery right there, don't you? That David is held tight in God's hands. And if you belong to Christ, you are held tight in God's hands. Please remember that today. When you are leaving today, I'm held tight in God's hands. But there's another side of this. It says your enemies will be hurled away like a stone from a sling. What do you think she may be referring to right there? Well, a few chapters before this, one of the first things we find out about David is he goes out to battle a guy named Goliath. And if you know the story, you know that he goes out there with 5 smooth stones, and he goes out with a sling, and as he gets close to Goliath, he puts a stone in a sling, and he swings it around and hits Goliath right on the forehead, right in a place where he didn't have any armor, knocks him down, knocks him out. David goes up, cuts his head off, holds his head up in victory, and Israel became victorious that day. She is reminding David that God was with him in the past to do this great thing, that God is not finished with him yet, that he needs to continue to trust God and to remember him. She is saying, David, when you come into your kingdom, she's not saying if you come into your kingdom, she's saying when you come into your kingdom. She has a lot of trust in David. She's saying basically, you don't want this bloodshed on your record, do you? You don't want this blood on your hands. You don't want this to be something that comes back to you and is brought up from time to time. You know, one of the things that's happening in today's hiring circles is that when people, like in a business or even a church, are going to hire somebody, one of the things that they do, if they're really interested in that person, they're going to do a background check on them. They want to find out, make sure that everything in that background check is clean. They want to make sure they're not hiring somebody they're going to get surprised later on by something that suddenly shows up. They also do a credit check. And they want to find out if this person is okay with handling money, that they're not tremendously in debt and maybe leaving behind bills in different places where they're coming from. They want to make sure that this is an upright individual who handles their money wisely in a moral type of way as well. But there's another thing they're going to do. They're also going to look at Facebook and other social media, and they're going to find out what this person has been saying now for the past 3 or 4, 5, 6 years. They want to know if this person gets on there and does all kinds of crazy stuff that's going to come back on them, and it's going to make them look bad. Churches are interested in that, as are businesses. And so what we see in this is that Abigail is saying, David, you are going to have this record. People are going to be able to look back, and they're going to do this background check on you, and they're going to say that you let Saul off the hook, but you came swooping down on Nabal, killed him, killed all the men in his household, and you don't want that to be something that people can point to. And they'll say, look at that. Here's our king in that regard. So she talks to David, and she gives a bold speech. She says basically to him, David, you don't mess up your future. There's already one fool in this story. It's my husband. She says, isn't one fool enough? God expects more of you, David. And she's basically saying to David, hey, get a reality check right here. And David is saying to himself, I need to do a reality check. He's saying, what will happen to my future if I do this? And that's a question I think that all of us need to ask, isn't it? If I were to do this thing, what would it do to my future? Would it be something I'd be proud of, or be something that would always kind of haunt me, always kind of follow me? Is this something that always is going to come up on an interview? Is this always something that's going to come up in my relationships? Is this always going to be something that comes up in my deepest thoughts? Is this something that I should do, or should I stay away from this? If it's okay, that's one thing. But if it's something that's going to haunt me, I don't want to do it. And she is saying to him, you want to be right before God, and you want to be right before other men. And David wants to be right before God, and so he listens. In verse 32, he says, praise be to the Lord. Verse 34, he says, finally, I have heard your words. That means I have listened to your voice. I will obey your voice. David is softening right here. Remember, it says that Nabal was hard, churlish. He's like rock, stone. But David is softening up right here, because Abigail was a woman who used her intuition as well. She was intuitive. There's something about a woman's intuition, isn't there? Guys, we just know that women seem to have this extra sense about them. I don't get that, because we're so much smarter than them in every other area. But that intuition, only joking, only teasing. Do not throw tomatoes, okay? You know what I'm getting at right here. Women have this kind of built-in intuition that's very special. It's something that she has right here, too. She's intuitive. And she must have believed that God had something more for her. And she asked David to remember her when he comes into his kingdom. That sounds kind of strangely familiar, doesn't it? Isn't that interesting? Because in the Old Testament, we've already seen that, because Rahab was a prostitute who lived in Jericho. And when some guys went in to kind of spy out the area, she hid them for a while. And then she said, please remember me when you come back. And they said, hang a red cord out the window, and nothing will happen to you or your household. Everyone is gathered there. We will leave you alone. And certainly that happened, and Rahab ended up being an ancestress of Jesus. But then we go to the New Testament, and we see there's Jesus hanging on the cross. He's got a thief on either side of him, and both of them at first are really railing on him, putting him down. But after a while, one of them softens as he watches Jesus' response to the crowds, as he hears Jesus' words, and he finally says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, today you'll be with me in paradise. So when this lady, Abigail, is saying something to David, she's saying, remember me in the future. There's an intuition that she has right here that they're going to meet again. Somehow or another, she doesn't know what it is, but she wants to make sure that it's positively influenced by her help to him. She goes back home. And she leaves this food with David and his men. She goes back home. She hasn't told her husband what she was going to do. She knew she had to act immediately to stave off disaster. Have you ever noticed there are certain things that we need to do pretty quickly to take advantage of the opportunity, or else it's just going to pass us by? I ran across a story once about a guy who was, long before cell phone time, he was in a phone booth. He had called up his wife. He was on a trip and wanted to call her and just have a conversation with her. And as they were talking towards the end of that conversation, they got cut off. Something happened, and he just couldn't get the signal. There was static and everything, so he just hung up and was disappointed by that. As he was walking away from the phone rang again. He thought maybe it was her calling back, and so he went back to the phone booth to pick it up. He said, hello, and it was the operator on the end of the line. And she said this. She says, hey, I just wanted to let you know that just after you were cut off, your wife said, I love you. Now, that was a perceptive and intuitive operator. She acted quickly, and the opportunity was not lost. And that's how Abigail reacted, and she averted disaster right here. But she goes back home, and Nabal has been having this big banquet, and he is drunk as a skunk, and she doesn't want to talk to him at this point. She knows that she's much better off talking to him when he's sober. So the next day she goes in and starts talking to him, and she shares with him about how close he came to being dead meat himself, of being fried by David and his men. And it tells us in the scripture that Nabal was so upset that he had a stroke at that point. And the Bible tells us that he his heart failed him. He became like a stone. You know what that means? That means he was paralyzed. He just couldn't move. He was so upset, and the stroke affected him in that way. Now, what caused the stroke? Well, obviously, pride and anger affected him. There's no doubt about that. Maybe he was upset because his wife talked to David without his permission. Was it shock from coming this close to being somebody who was dead? Was it because Abigail had befriended David, and if King Saul found out about that, he might come swooping down on Nabal, take all of his stuff, and even have him killed? Whatever it was, ultimately, it was the Lord who took his life. He died a foolish man 10 days later. Now, can you hear David's reaction after he hears that Nabal died? He's probably thinking back to this conversation he had with Abigail, and he's saying to himself, I am so glad I didn't go and kill him. Man, Lord, thank you for saving me from doing something really stupid. Thank you for sending Abigail to me and helping me to not follow through, helping me to think about the situation. Later, David wrote in Psalm 141, let a righteous man strike me. It's a kindness. Let him rebuke me. It's oil on my head. My head will not refuse it. What he's saying is, God, if somebody has to wake me up, even with a smack to the head, help me to accept it as a good thing. Help me to wake up when I'm in this thinking when it's going to mess me up and when it's going to backfire on me. Thank you, Lord. Let a righteous man wake me up, strike me in the head. My head will not refuse it, is essentially what he's saying. Abigail told David the truth in a way that made sense. It was what he needed to hear. And she was a woman who was beneficial to him. She continued to be beneficial. Just like in the best stories, when the good guys win, the good gals win as well. And Abigail was set free from a marriage which was a total drain on her. She became the wife of David, and David would have inherited Nabal's property as well. Isn't that an interesting twist in the story about something that could have gone extremely badly but turned out to be a good thing for Abigail and for David? And David eventually moved a royal residence at Hebron, which is near where Nabal's property was, and he and Abigail had a son together named Caleb. Now, Abigail's story ought to make us reflective. There are so many forces in this world that can drag us into foolish living. Here are some good questions to ask ourselves if we desire to live wisely. The first question is this: do I remember my calling? Do I remember my calling? David was a called person. Back in chapter 16, God gave him a promise: you will be the next king. And Abigail is saying, don't forget who you are. Don't forget who you are called to be. The Bible tells us if we are a follower of Jesus Christ, we are called by him. We have to remember that we are who we are in Christ. Abigail reminds David of who he is and what his calling is. A second question we need to ask ourselves: am I a teachable person? Am I a teachable person? Remember what the servants of Nabal said? He's such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. It's interesting, the Bible talks about a person who is called a fool. And a fool is described as somebody who is unteachable and somebody who is uncorrectable. In Proverbs chapter 9 it says, fools say, who are you to tell me how to live my life? In other words, a fool won't accept any kind of correction, any kind of direction. They just won't accept it because they think they have all the answers. They think they are always going to have to be in charge. There's a main thing that separates David and Nabal here because they both have some things in common. Both of them are angry, but both are intense. Both of them are descending into destruction, but David listens when Nabal will not listen. David's willing to be corrected, even if it comes from a source that he did not expect, and that is a beautiful woman named Abigail. And you and I will stay stuck in certain areas in our lives if we are not willing to listen to correction, if we are not willing to be teachable, if we're not willing to hear what God may be saying to us, even through an unexpected source. A last question is, am I redeemable? Ultimately, the Bible is not written a self-help book or a self-improvement story. The Bible is a redemption story. Someone comes from some other place and offers to redeem us. In a sense, before God, all of us are sort of like Nabal and David. The Bible says before we come to Christ that we are all enemies of God. Our life was on the wrong track, and we needed help to get on the right track. We needed someone to come along and help us to do that. And that's the story of the gospel. That's the good news about Jesus Christ. And a big question we need to ask ourselves is, am I open to God's grace? Am I open to God coming to somebody, or coming through somebody, helping me to get on the right track? There was another farmer I want to tell you about, and this farmer also had some sheep, and interestingly enough, he had some neighbors, and the neighbors had a dog, and this dog was not a controlled dog. He would get on this farmer's property, and he would go out and he would kill sheep from time to time. And the farmer went to the neighbors and said, hey, your dog is killing my sheep. Can we put the dog away? Can you lock it up? And the neighbors, when they heard this request that was given in a kind way, they got resistant. They got kind of mean in their response, and they refused to do it. So the farmer went back home just hoping that maybe reason would come to them, and yet it didn't. In fact, the dog continued to come onto his property and kill more sheep. And he's thinking to himself, I could poison that dog, or I could shoot that dog, and you know what? Most people would feel like he'd be justified in either one of those things. But instead, he decided to do something different. He decided that when it came time for lambs to be born, after one of those lambs was weaned, that he would take that lamb over to the neighbor's house, to the neighbor's children, and to give it to them. And he did. And as soon as those neighbors received this little lamb, the dog was locked away. This man gave a gift of a sheep that changed the course of the lives of those on his property and those on another property. God has given us a great gift in the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ himself. And he wants us to be reconciled with him. He wants our relationship to be a good one. He doesn't want to have this animosity or enmity between him and us. He wants us to be in the same family. And so he gave us the gift of Jesus to come and to die on the cross for us, to take our place and to raise up from the dead. And the Bible tells us that Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No man goes to the Father but through me. He's saying, look, I am God in the flesh. I've come from heaven, and I know the way back. I am the way back. You got to come through me. And so today, if you are here and you're saying, I'm at this crossroads of my thinking right now, which way am I going to go? I hope that you'll choose to go in the direction of where Jesus Christ is, because he is the way to get you there. And your life will become different as you surrender to him.